thanks to the Microbiology Consortium of the Philippines, headed by Dr. Wendell Rivera, for this kind invitation to inform you about PAGTANAW 2050 and its connection and relevance to your discipline, which is microbiology. Can I have the first slide, please? I have entitled my presentation as you have entitled your event for today, PAGTANAW 2050 and Microbiology. PAGTANAW 2050 is a Philippine Foresight document that is oriented towards science, technology, and innovation. So it's not the total foresight that should be generated at this time as we look forward to 2050. Next slide, please. Let me start by sharing with you some overarching considerations as we harness science, technology, and innovation in the development agenda. And it is now quite clear that the marketplace that we are dealing with, and that's global and even national, is knowledge-based. We have to gather data, and this data gathering activity is now supported by tools that allow us to see more, to detect more, to sense more through the use of different tools in biology, in chemistry, in physics, in earth science, collectively known as sensorization, and sometimes known as the Internet of Things. We also have now tools that will process data into information, as it is now evolving into a more sophisticated discipline called data science, analytics, and aided by artificial intelligence. Next slide, please. Talent development and retention is of highest importance in enhancing our national learning capacity, because our national learning capacity is really governed by the brains that we have in residence and brains that would like to help us achieve the goals of our development agenda. Next slide, please. Talent development and retention is of highest importance because it is human capital and access to education that is the most important factor underpinning technological progress. And what the human capital is informed about will influence the pace of our technological change, because there are some technologies which may not be profitable if you don't have the skills. And the composition of the human capital affects the direction of technological progress. And you will realize later what I mean by this, because this is manifested in the terms talent deficit. Next slide, please. It is quite clear to all of us who are now engaged in academia, in teaching and learning, that knowledge does not diffuse on its own. It has to be transmitted and it has to be received. And there are barriers at both ends. Next slide, please. So we need to have efficient knowledge workers, which means they must be highly trained and they must know how to teach, and they must teach our students in learning how to learn, and it must be partnered with knowledge institutions that enable and facilitate the knowledge workers to accomplish their tasks and goals. The importance of a facilitative and enabling environment is quite critical in our effort to produce and process talent and retain them in our shores. Next slide, please. It is evident in the experience of many countries that talent is importance if we want to convert our knowledge into wealth. And so I salute the Philippines, the Microbiology Consortium of the Philippines for looking at this effort to transform knowledge into wealth, into something that will provide the wherewithal for our population to enjoy their well-being and a better quality of life. Next slide, please. Let me now turn to the local scene, the Philippine scene, and establish the context by which PAGTANAW 2050 was put together. And this starts from our realization of the aspirations as manifested by a nationwide survey conducted in 2016 called Ambisyon Natin 2040, which as a conclusion establishes the aspiration of Philippine society by 2050 to be matatag, maginhawa at panatag. Conscious of the fact that all of these can only be realized if we are able to establish a good scheme for human capital development, especially in the harnessing of science, technology, and innovation. The other manifestation of our aspirations is the Philippine Development Plan, which is current, but we hope that this will also be updated in the new administration to promote technology adoption and stimulate innovation. And our aspiration is to be able to realize a country that values malasakit, that values pagbabago, and that values continuity in development, patuloy na pag-unlad. Next slide, please. With these aspirations, we also need to be aware that such cannot be attained unless the minimum basic needs are addressed. And these minimum basic needs have been defined in our Republic Act 8425 as follows. Survival, which covers food, nutrition, health, water, sanitation, clothing, security, shelter, peace and order, public safety, income, and livelihood, and the enabling needs, which are basic education and literacy, participation in community development, and a wholesome family and psychosocial care system. So these are very important things to remember when we try to align whatever we do in our effort to address our national development agenda. Next slide, please. We are also in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution, and I have read many articles that this is soon to end and we will soon move into the fifth industrial revolution. But as of today, the fourth industrial revolution is the basis for our innovation. And it is a combination of technologies, as you will realize later. It cannot be promoted by only one technology, although the information and communication technology seems to dominate the discussions. But it also involves the strengthening and the enhancement of the basic sciences and mathematics, which discover the new things in nature, new principles that enable us to move forward and harness materials so that we can enjoy a sustainable well-being and lifestyle. Next slide, please. Now, let me summarize what we have just covered in the few slides. And that is, we need a critical mass of talent. We need not only one microbiologist in the Philippines, but many thousands. We need many chemists. We need engineers, we need doctors, we need um, craftsmen, those who are trained in skills, because all of these will have to respond to the basic needs of a growing population as it is manifested in Republic Act 8425. In planning and managing an economy, now stated as the task of economic managers, but it's not that just the task, but the economy that we are envisioning in PAGTANAW 2050 is one that takes into account our maritime base, our archipelagic nature, and an economy that is sustainably competitive globally, and an economy that is circular. And I'll explain this in a little bit more detail later. And just to emphasize that our environment is threatened, it must be also an economy that manages environmental degradation and its effect on climate change, which for now is articulated into what we call a circular economy. Next slide, please. Looking at the future, we need to really be aware of the trends and drivers and pressures that come by our way. And many Foresight studies identify them as follows: the geopolitical and geoeconomic shifts, such as what is now happening in Ukraine and Russia, systemic competition, that is our global market. We need to be very aware of that, and also local market, and a good reading of what will allow us to sustainably participate in the global market. Rapid technological change, you are very much aware of that. And of course, the transnational challenges. These are issues that we cannot solve alone, such as poverty, climate change, rising sea levels, etc. That is really a responsibility of the global community. And on top of these four, we have the unknown unknowns, the black swans that come by which we do not expect, such as 9/11. And this is something we need to be very prepared for. And that is, again, an argument for having talent in residence and having talent that we prepare to be trained this early so that when black swans come, we can deal with them responsibly. Next slide, please. Let me just invite you for a few seconds to look at the projected increases in our population. And this is from the Philippine Statistics Authority. Overall, we expect to grow to 142 million by 2045. That is 5 years short of 2050. The figures that we see in the literature about the projection of our population by 2050 is 144 million. The census of the year 2020 established our population at 109 million. So if you go by your arithmetic, 144 minus 109 is an increase of 35 million Filipinos in the next 30 years. 33 million here in the to 2045. And you can see the regions where the growth is going to be very fast and very large. Now, we should not take this for granted, because you need to feed these people. You need to provide the minimum basic needs for 35 million more Filipinos in 2050. And how do we do this? What strategies do we use? What kind of science and technology do we prioritize so that all of us will have a higher quality of life by the year 2050 and presumably be able to eradicate poverty. So I hope you appreciate these increases, because these are not very trivial things to attend to. Every million mouths more to feed will require so many more thousands of hectares of rice to harvest, and so forth and so on. More hospitals to establish, more school rooms, etc. Just on the material side. And how about in the training and skills development side? So I hope you appreciate this table and take this into account as you put together a research proposal. Next slide, please. On top of all of these considerations, and primarily the effort to be able to address the needs of a growing population, and it's not trivial because the growth is going to be in millions. There are sustainable development goals that are globally accepted, and I will not go through them anymore. You are, I'm assuming, familiar with all of them, and making an effort to align your teaching and your research so that students and the future generations will be aware of the sustainable development goals and do their part as best as they can. Next slide, please. This is what I have referred to earlier as a circular economy. When the raw materials are drawn from sources, either natural or synthetic, they go through a production process, and the production process indeed will produce byproducts. You need an internal recycling process, and the consumer product that they generate during the production is moved to the consumption arena, where you also generate wastes like packaging materials. And how do you then find ways to reuse them, or just consider them as waste to be channeled to a waste management system that will hopefully produce recyclables, and then go through a recycling process that will also produce waste. And so you have a never-ending cycle, but you will also have recovered material that will be inputted again to the production process. So it's a relatively closed system. It's not really 100% recycling, because in your waste management system, you have residues that you'll have to deal with over and over again. And you have your health risks. And all of this will always involve the habitability of our planet. Next slide, please. Now, it is important to realize that the circular economy is not just something that we like to promote for the sake of change, but we must realize that there are conditions for human productivity that we need to uphold and maintain. First, our health and wealth are completely dependent on an organized processing of matter in natural cycles. Second, degradation of matter and energy takes place in all processes. We rely on ecosystems that not only supply us with food, water, raw materials, but also receive and process our garbage and sewage. I think you realize now how important microbiology is in this particular factor. Now, with a large population of raw materials extracted, the reconstruction of the biosphere is strained, like when you conduct open pit mining, and the recent ruling of the court on the Marinduque mining tailings and residues, and many more factories now which are not mindful of the way by which they discharge their waste. And it is essential to remember that if wastes are not recycled, no process can be sustained, and the process will come to an end. Next slide, please. So that's the value of refining a circular economy, which in a scientific way takes into account the Earth's ability to regenerate itself, which we are slowly gaining more understanding about. And again, microbiology really plays a very major role here. And the Earth's ability to absorb waste, which come in the form of irreversible changes at the boundary of restricted opportunity space. That means when you dump high concentrations of certain materials, that's not really the natural process, but you are really challenging and straining a particular ecosystem by putting a higher concentration of waste and residues into it. So science is now slowly being able to understand this. This is not very easy to do, but I think I must challenge the microbiologists that they do play a major role in understanding all of this, because a lot of the regeneration processes in nature involve microbial transformations and processes, and a lot of the ability of Earth to absorb waste is also affected by microbiology, the population of microbes in a particular environment. Next slide, please. Now, we go to why we need to think about these problems in advance. And this is articulated by Jeremy Farrar, who is now the director of Wellcome Foundation, the largest funder of health research in the world. He is a medical doctor, and this is what he said. This is a very recent quote, reacting to the way countries have responded to the pandemic. And that is, you cannot just build science when you think you need it. You invest in people, teams, and infrastructure over the years, and provides the bedrock that is so important in a crisis. I think many of you who were my colleagues in biotech here at UPLB remember the time when we funded a lot of projects on vaccine production. And because people did not think it was very important, now that it looms to be a very major factor in managing pandemics, the Virology Institute of the Philippines is being enacted into law. I'm not saying it's too late, but we should have done that much, much earlier. Next slide, please. And this is what foresight is all about. It's really anticipation, but you need some intelligence gathering. You need some spying. You need some reading. You need to understand what's happening. You need to understand what are the changes that are taking place. And then you can anticipate what roadmaps to take. Next slide, please. And this is what PAGTANAW 2050 is all about. It aims to, at the end of 2050, realize a prosperous archipelagic and maritime nation. Next slide, please. Harnessing the tools to innovate, the talent to innovate, and a combination of the talent and tools will hopefully be able to bring us to a prosperous archipelagic and maritime nation by 2050. That's about just close to 30 years from now. Next slide, please. Just to remind us why we need to continually be aware and sensitive to our archipelagic and maritime features. We have a lot of islands, and this is a challenge because it's difficult to reach some of them, and some of them are inhabited. And so our aim to be inclusive is really a big factor in connecting these islands. We have lots of land, about 30 million hectares, 36,000 kilometers of coastline, the fifth largest in the world, but about a bigger marine environment of 220 million hectares. 60% of our population reside along the coast and about the same land area as Pakistan, Japan, and Spain. Next slide, please. This is the framework of PAGTANAW 2050. And I earlier talked about tools and talent. So if you look at the left side, science, technology, and innovation is based on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics as they are trained so that we can realize what the next generation technologies are to apply to 12 operational areas and realize the aspirations of Ambition Natin 2040 and the Philippine Development Plan. I'll explain this in more detail later, but just bear in mind, the whole issue is harnessing tools and talent so that we can address the 12 different operational areas by undertaking processes of analysis, interpretation, and a realization of risk and potential using methods such as bibliometrics, SWOT, brainstorming, and the Delphi methods, and many others which you will be able to derive if you're interested to look at the literature. Next slide, please. These are the contents, and just go through them quickly from how the methods that are used, and chapters on the aspiration, chapters on the current status of science, technology, and innovation in the Philippines. Next slide, please. A listing of what now we know as uncertainties, risks, shocks, and the black swans as we have experienced it. A roadmap to the future and a section on ensuring continuity and relevance. There are 550 references which might be of interest to you, and a list of 207 technologies that can be a menu for applications to problems we meet in the 12 operational areas. Next slide, please. We have listed here just the major disruptive sciences and technologies from the 207. And you can see how important the different emerging sciences and technologies are, and where your microbiologists can really play a major role. In the basic sciences, which you should not forget, in, of course, mathematics and statistics. Hopefully you are training people in bioinformatics, biotechnology, definitely, neuroscience, definitely, the new materials, definitely, and of course, big data and artificial intelligence as you analyze information and so forth. You can see the importance also of the social sciences. Next slide, please. These are the 12 operational areas which I referred to earlier that we should interface with technologies: the blue economy, governance, business and trade, digital technology and ICT, science education, food security, health, energy, water, environment, shelter, transportation, and other infrastructure, and space exploration. Next slide, please. Now, let me make suggestions on the roadmaps and just explain to you how the PAGTANAW 2050 envisions the roadmaps in an integrated manner. Next slide, please. We have clustered the 12 operational areas into 4: environment and climate change, food, health and nutrition, energy and water, and the built environments. And individually, these clusters will have to put together roadmaps for our current situation, which is to responsibly manage human, animal, and plant pests and diseases, going on to the next phase of a revived economy, on to high growth development, and finally to a competitive economy where we are all educated and healthy, productive in an inclusive and sustainable manner. Each of the clusters have their own unique plans that need to be generated so that we are able to align ourselves to these four different phases. We did not put any periods or timelines because we don't know how it will fare. 30 years will involve 5 presidential administrations, as you probably already realize. And the question of continuity will always be there. Next slide, please. Microbes and PAGTANAW 2050. I think this is preaching to the choir, but let me just say how important your discipline is in PAGTANAW 2050. Microbes make up most of living matter and display tremendous diversity. And yet, very few of them have been cultured and studied. Microbes do most of the biogeochemical recycling that keeps the world habitable. And microbes, of course, are theorized to be the first forms of life that appeared on Earth about 4 billion years ago, and definitely critically important in sustaining life on our planet. Next slide, please. Let me just go through what you already know, but to just highlight your roles and a possible guidance in the roadmaps that you will lay out later. Microbes, of course, have a wide diversity of physiology and metabolism. The question is, have we an active program nationally to look at microbes from different environments and see what their uniquenesses are in terms of physiology and metabolism and how they can potentially be used to produce high-value products? Next slide, please. Of course, you know there are causal agents for some plant, animal, and human diseases. They need to be managed. We need to develop drugs, vaccines. We need to develop ways of controlling them, and that's a big challenge for all. Next slide. Food processing and food preservation. Very obvious, of course, even before our science, rigorous science, food science principles developed. We already had folk science on food processing and food preservation, the Biko, the Buro, etc. Next slide, please. And of course, now a realization of how the microbiome is affecting a lot of our activities. And this is a cover topic of the May 27 issue of Science, just a few days ago, yesterday, which I received. And it's interesting reading, although I think you already understand what its role would be. And let me just scroll through the next few slides to emphasize how important they are. Next slide, please. In the diagnosis of diseases, we now know, for example, how ulcers are being affected by your microbiomes, even diabetes. Next slide, please. Crop production, microbially based soil nutrient enhancers, and the question of how they maintain the balance of nutrients in the soil. I think you should just review the results of the long-term trials at Erie, where a plot that has not been fertilized with nitrogen for the last 40, 50 years maintained a yield of the same over time. Next slide, please. Bioremediation. Of course, some of you are engaged in this, I know, very actively, and I hope that you are succeeding in your effort. Next slide, please. And of course, the transformations that we barely have been able to take advantage of in the production of fine chemicals and biopolymers. I think we should seriously look at our biopolymers, especially nata, and see how we can harness them. The most expensive headphone in the market, $4,000 to $6,000, made by Sony, has a vibrating membrane made out of nata. So we have failed to take that opportunity to produce these high quality biomembranes and be the sole source in the world for high quality and high value electronic systems. Next slide, please. And you know how molecular biology has progressed using microbes and their products in understanding how the genomes behave, how to select superior traits, etc. Next slide, please. And of course, the various roles of the microbiome that will emerge in the future, we still, I think, have barely scratched the surface. Next slide, please. So, in this new century, as Sir Robert May says, it wants deciding what kind of world we want really is to make harness the opportunities in science, and the menu and the discussions I hope will trigger further thinking in your part, further refinement. You are all microbiologists, I am not, and see where the opportunities are, rather than just waiting for things to happen. Next slide, please. And a livelihood that protects, conserves, and restores the environment. And my suggestion is, next slide, please, to engage in biocommerce, which harness the emerging applications of biological resources, not only plants, but also animals and microbes to produce high-valued products apart from food. The problem with our agriculture is we are too food-oriented. Of course, that's very justified, especially with the growing population. But we have missed a lot of opportunities in looking at high-valued products that we need to develop from our unique resources. Next slide, please. And you have the tools of synthetic biology to look at pharmaceuticals, chemicals, flavors and fragrance, feedstocks and commodities, and of course, industrial biotechnology. The problem with our pharmaceutical industry is we don't produce fine chemicals here. So we cannot really produce drugs on our own. We just package them and we just put them together in packages so we can sell them. But the synthetic biology system, of course, is kind of anchored towards genetic engineering, DNA synthesis, and coupled with engineering to scale up and manufacturing. Next slide, please. Another scheme to look at, which is advanced manufacturing platforms anchored on biodesign. And here, I think the microbiologists will have a major role, not only because the generation time of your organisms are quite short compared to plants and animals. Next slide, please. So again, just to remind you of the different spaces in PAGTANAW 2050. Next slide. And hopefully you will, with increasing understanding of what it is, be able to help us refine it further. Most of you are much younger than I am, and a lot of responsibility for updating this, refining this, making it more relevant, and doing what we should now rests on your shoulders. Next slide, please. And that is what Hemingway wants us to do. What will happen in all the other days that ever come will depend on what you do today. Next slide. Acknowledgements to DOST, to Dr. Rodora Azanza, to the writers, to the 335 participants in various meetings, the artists, the editorial team, the project support staff, and the NAS Secretariat, without which we could not have finished PAGTANAW 2050. Next slide. Thank you. And if there is time for questions, I will be ready to answer them. Thank you.